Hi everyone, here's a quick review of Chapter 5, Working with Data Files. Basic idea with data files was that what we wanted to do was use information that was stored in a data file or stored in non-volatile memory. Right? So in the past, in our programs previously, we had to enter in information through the keyboard and we displayed the output on a display. And that's somewhat limiting in terms of getting information in. You can only go as fast as you can type. And when you actually went through and processed the data and then displayed the results, that would go away, of course, after the program is closed. Now, it's often the case where we have a lot of information that was previously retrieved or generated through some kind of telemetry, and we would have that stored in some non-volatile storage, which would typically be a data file. At the end, when we actually go through and process the information, it's often the case where we want to write this information out to a data file also. Okay, and here were some of the examples we had taken a look at. Okay, okay. So just a few things, how we actually go and read information from data files. There's some additional things additional header information that we need to set up to use data files, both input and output. And one of the ways we can actually get information from a data file is we use the redirection operators, such as when we wanted to read from the keyboard. We use the same thing, except what we create is a file object. Okay. Also, when we want to write out, instead of writing out to the keyboard, what we do is we use the same redirection operator here, and we use that, and then we write out to the file object, which is connected to our output file. Okay. All right. So a few things we need to do, before that, we had C in and C out, right? C in, we got information from the keyboard. C out, we wrote data out to the display. Okay. And there's one other one, C error. We didn't really use C error, but C error is another way if you wanted to write out an error message. We typically just use C out, which is fine. Okay. Okay. So this just describes the standard devices, right? C out, C in, okay, which we've done, and C error. Okay. Now, when we actually want to set up to use a data file, we need to set up what's called a file stream. Okay. And there are a few steps to do that. Okay. And in the past, when we actually went through and we wanted to create variables, we had to go through, or we wanted to use variables, we had to go through a process of declaration where we declare the variables. Then we may initialize it also. So we might do like integer x equals to 5. Let's say an integer was the data type, and x was the name, and 5 was the value that we wanted to initialize it with. When we use these things called classes, classes are somewhat, I think, analogous to, at least when you think about how you use them, to a data type. So instead of putting like integer, you would use like if stream in this case if you wanted to have a input file stream object. Okay, and we'll see that in an example. You'll see how that's done. Okay, and if you wanted to actually you have an object that you read from, so a file that you read from, you use the if stream object. And if you wanted to have one that where you write to the file, you use the of stream, or you create an of stream object, which you use the of stream class. Okay. Well, in order for us to use these two, we need to include the fstream include file. Okay. So this is the header file, fstream header file, and we'll see how to do that. So there's a few extra steps when you're actually going through and working with files, a little bit more than what we had done previously when we had worked with just the keyboard and the display. Okay. So a few other things. This is a little bit beyond the scope of what we've done, but what we found was that and actually it's supposed to be parens here, which is kind of missing here, but it's okay. It's just like write and close. You can actually, there are different ways to get information from a file. You can use write, you can use read, you can use the redirection operators like what we did. You can use a get, which we'll see. Uh, but we'll see all that. The open, really, this is where you would connect to a file. And this one could be that, if you wanted to write out, you can actually use this so-called write method, or what they call it, a function, which we haven't, which is actually covered in the next chapter. And then you close it when you're done working with it. So you open it, you do some work with the file, and then at the end you close it. And this is both for input files and output files. Okay. All right. So these are the basic steps, right? We had gone through to use files. We had to include the fstream header file, and then either we declared a file stream object, or another term they use is instantiation of a file stream object. So this is kind of like what we had done before. We might have, declared a variable of type double or integer or a boolean or something, and then the name. And this, of course, fn is the name that the user defines. Okay, so this is like your file stream object variable name, if you want to think about it that way. And here's another one. This is an output stream object. So if you want to read from an object, read from a file, you would use this. If you wanted to write out to an object file, you would use this. The next step, of course, would be, this is where you would actually open the file stream object and connect it to a specific data file, okay, like data.txt or something else. And we'll look at an example. Then you do some operations. And these are where you would use the redirection operators, right? And for the most part, we're going to use them where you just do like, here, this becomes, this is my file f out, and this is f in for file input. And that's how you would work on, same way you would work with, writing out to the display and reading in from the keyboard. And at the end, you just go and close it. Close the object. Okay. Now, 3 different ways, basic ways of reading data from the file. This one was specified number of records was, we had a number at the beginning, and the first thing you read in was the number of records, right? You read that in, and then you used that to determine how many lines or how many records in the file that you're going to read. This one is, the trailer or sentinel signal is that you have some special value in the data stream as you're reading from the file, and it basically indicates to your program, oh, okay, it's time to stop reading information from the file. And then at the end, the last one here, we have end of file. Now we're going to use this function called EOF, or end of file, to determine if we've reached the end. This is the most common one used, okay? But you will see these in some of the other cases, right? Okay. So here's an example. And just to go over this kind of briefly, this is an example where you actually have, here's our IO stream. This is the typical header file that we include. Here's our F stream. This is one we needed to add. And then in this case, this particular example, it had CMath because we use some functions from CMath. Okay. All right. So the basic idea, this is our main, where we would write our code, and that's the only function that we use so far is main. Here's our double data type, and then here's the difference right here, right? We have an IF stream object f in, and this one is if we want to read from a data file. The next one is OF stream, or output file stream, f out. So in this case, just looking at the program initially here, you can see that you're reading information in from a data file, and then you're writing out to a data file also, okay? So after you declare or instantiate these objects, is another term they use, you open the connection, right? So here's fn. So here's my input data file. It's called datain.txt. And the requirement when you write it like this, of course, is that data file has to be in the same directory as your C++ code. Okay, let me just continue on here. The next thing we do here in this program is we open a connection to an output file, data output.txt. Okay, So now we have a connection to the input data file and the output data file. Okay. Now, one of the things that this particular example is missing, and which we haven't talked about, is if this file doesn't exist, right? Data.txt. Okay. That one, if it doesn't exist, what will happen is you'll get some unexpected results. It'll, actually execute. It'll go through and run, but you'll get some numbers that weren't as expected. So it would actually give you a so-called logic error, right? The next one is the data output.txt. This file is this is the output file, right? So if it's not there, this is just going to go out and create it. So that's not an issue, right? So the next line here is that this one reads in one, basically one item from the file and stores it in our variable X, okay? This one is written a little bit differently where it'll read the first one in and then use it, okay? And then we have a while loop. And the while loop, all it does is it goes through and it does CC while it says not file input object dot end of file. So as long as it's not, you haven't got to the end of the data file, it's going to keep reading in information from that data file. All right. And the only thing here we do is inside of the while loop, we have a selection structure, an if statement that basically just says, okay, if X is greater than 0, then perform this operation, which is just getting you the X, it's just exponent of X, okay? Then you read in another element. So you keep reading in, keep performing these operations, this math operation, and until you get to the end of the file, then you end here, and you get out of the loop after you get to the end of the file, and then you just close the input object and the output object, okay? Now, one of the notes here, of course, you need that data file to be in the same directory. You need to create it or add it to that directory. Okay. Okay. So you can actually modify this. You can modify it so that it supports a Sentinel signal. And what you would do, of course, is then inside of here, you would actually check to see if a value is something. So Sentinel signal, maybe it's less than minus 99, or maybe it's minus 99 or something. And you would put, as part of this, you would put another line in here. You would have a selection structure that would say if X is less than, or less than or equal to minus 99, then break out of this loop. Okay. So that would be the only real requirement for that. All right. Another part is that if you wanted to do specified number of records, then in the data file, you would put in a number at the beginning of your data file. And then up here, what you would do is right before this one, you would actually read it into number of records. And then instead of doing this, you would use a for loop. And the for loop would go around a number of times until you finally reach the number of records. And then you would end. Okay, so it's like a little bit different than this. And we've taken a look at that. We've already seen that. So my first example, the examples I look at are just going to use end of file. Okay. So those are a couple things you could do. It's a good exercise to know how to do these, right? Okay, error checking. Okay, so one of the things we found was that if you go through and run that file, run that program, and you find that the file doesn't exist or it's in the wrong place, then what happens is you get some unexpected results. So what we want to do is we actually want to go through and check to see if the file is opened properly. So after you do like fn.open and the name of your data file, you want to actually execute some code, okay? And the basic idea, and just prior to that, real quick with this, is that what happens is if it doesn't open properly, you have this so-called stream object, which goes into so-called error state, okay? And there are some attributes or bits, things that that are set, and this is, for the most part, you really don't need to know these, except that there's a couple things that we need to pay attention to. One of them is this end of file bit that gets set, and what you'll notice is, let me just back up, is that when we ran this, right here, this piece of code, when it's actually checking for this actually goes out and checks for that end of file bit to see if it's been set. Okay, so we're already using these here in this case. And the second part of this, of what we're going to do is we're going to actually go and, let me go forward a little. We're actually going to look at the fail bit also. Okay, and the fail bit, what we're going to use to check for that is just this Boolean fail. Okay, so what you would do is right after your code where you do like, fn dot open text, you'd put this in. You'd say fn dot fail, check to see if it opened properly. And what happens here is that if it didn't open properly, this comes out to be true. And then you display a message and then you do a return 0. We've also done like our return -1. You just need to do a return here. You could also do an exit. An exit will get you out of this too, will get you out of your program. When this code is executed and it gets to return, it knows, okay, end main function. Well, in our program, we only have one function. It's called main, so this actually ends the program. Okay? So this is what you would want to include in your file, right? So just basically, those are the basics, right, behind actually going through and using data files. These are the very basic things. There's some other ways you can get data, like you saw. You had the write function. You also have a get function, which we'll use, and I think we had used that in one of our previous examples. And the basic idea, you want to run a write, you want to read from your file into a variable, or read it into, or typically you would read it into a variable, a specific type of a variable. You'd use the input redirection operator. So it would go from like fn to your variable. And this one is just basically the other direction. And this basically says whatever your variable, write it out to your, on the other side, on the left-hand side, would be your file stream output object. Okay. So these are some of the basics. This is really just a quick overview of using files.